Thank you. Thank you to Dean Dr. Zahra and to the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality for the invitation, perhaps the misplaced faith in my ability to span the global response in the 25 minutes given to me, beyond my time and beyond my expertise. So this is what my plan is. My plan is to find a way to enable us to read the responses in their diversity as responses both to the situation before us, the particular event of the anti-Islam video, but also to find a way to think about these as both responses to a specific event and responses that have nothing to do with the event itself. I mean, we're all relatively aware, I think, of the likelihood that the sort of range of social mobilization, political activism, legal response, and foreign policy implications have something to do with a YouTube video, but also perhaps something to do with a long trajectory, both of Western characterizations of the Muslim and things that are sacred to the Muslim, but also with ways in which Muslim response is recognized in the world at large. So the first question is, how do we know a response when we see one? And the second of which is, what is possible to do about the range of Muslim responses? And in this, rather than talk about the vast range, I'll do is talk a little bit about what's happening in Pakistan and what's happening in Egypt legislatively. And then to think a little bit about foreign policy implications. Recommendations are, again, dangerous things. I won't do that. But ways of reading might be helpful, and such as they are, I will offer a few at the end. So, the first question, how do we recognize a response to the anti-Islam video when we see it? The first question is, what are these responses to? Where are they responses? From whom are they responses? And to whom are they being broadcast? And to what ends with what implications? And so in this, I'd like to place the question of blasphemy and the regulation of speech in a longer time frame, and to think about three places: Pakistan, Egypt, and the United States, as a way of thinking about some of the social, political, and policy issues before us. The issue of blasphemy obviously has a long history. I'd like to pick up on that history in 1989 with the publication of the Satanic Verses and the large, public, visible, and increasingly, made increasingly more visible Muslim response to what was understood to be a text, insulting the person of the Prophet and calling into question the divinity of the text of the Quran. And here, the question of technology and the responses to technology as a problem are important. The publication of the Satanic Verses, as Fred mentioned as well, and the inciting event and its response were often divorced in time from each other. There wasn't an immediate outcry. The outcry was later and quite geographically disparate from the places of its publication as well. People have been reading the beginning of public incitement to Muslim response to blasphemy in what we now call a fatwa, although it was a series of sermons delivered by the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran and later outside of it, condemning the book, condemning the insulting of the person of the Prophet and the text of the Quran. And this led in India, in Pakistan, and throughout other places in the Muslim world to widespread protest against the text itself, and to a very, very high-profile discussion outside the Muslim world as well about the question of blasphemy. The way that this discussion was understood did a number of things, very, very few of which I'm going to be able to talk about here. But one of the things that emerged from the discussion of the Satanic Verses and the way in which we interpreted the response to the publication of the Satanic Verses was that of a worldwide monolithic Muslim public ready to respond to the sort of theological pronouncements or the commands of a particular religious authority, and whose response was inevitably incendiary, violent, mass mobilized, and uncontrollable. Since then, various kinds of Muslim public protest have been indexed within this trajectory, including responses to Quran burnings and desecrations in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Texas and in Florida, on U.S. military in U.S. military facilities within the Middle East, within social media, and then again at this moment under the context of deliberate provocation of Muslims on YouTube. Who were the major players that emerged from this story? One major player has been the authoritarian state in the Muslim world, whose interests have been always to monitor and steer political expression. Another player that emerges, and we'll talk about the accuracy of these characterizations later, is the vision of an undifferentiated Muslim street, easy to incite, difficult to quell. Other players include external powers in the West, whose interests are both to maintain a certain security military détente with authoritarian states, and yet also mount an ideological and ethical campaign in the face of potential intervention and domestic pressure. Another actor are the Western media, again, for whom freedom of expression is a key concern, but whose ways of understanding what a story is and how to tell it have everything to do with the cast of characters that we then identify. And then within these stories, one or two central figures were cast as voices of protest or conscience, from Salman Rushdie to today's big story of the young woman in Pakistan, Malala Yousafzai. Increasingly, a major player has been technology, which disseminates, diversifies, makes agenda harder to control, but also is within the interests of authoritarian governments to monitor and restrict, and increasingly the media outlets within these states who choose the timing of events. Again, the anti-Islam video put on YouTube in July, but not picked up in the Egyptian media until September. And each kind of technological shift elicits a response from governments as a crisis to be met. In 1989, it was the circulation through radio and through cassette tapes of these sermons, first in Iran and then throughout the world. Later, it's the question of the internet and how it's possible to control inflammatory speech, or for that matter, wrongful speech on the internet, and now it's the question of social media. Each of these is treated as a separate policy problem to be dealt with in particular ways. And blasphemy plays into all of these interests in key ways. Each of these players that I've identified also index into the issue of blasphemy in important ways. I'd like to argue that the question of blasphemy is in large part a struggle over who gets to speak on behalf of Islam, at a time when this question has become both an electoral and a moral issue, both a question of popular mobilization as well as the fate of regimes in the Middle East, precisely because authoritarian states are weaker than they used to be. And so the language of Islam and the language of democratization and legitimacy are coming into traction with each other, not in new ways, but in increasingly significant, politically mobilized ways. So the question of blasphemy isn't going away anytime soon. And the question isn't as simple as Muslims and Islamists are repressive, secularists are progressive. This is also a language that's increasingly being polarized within the Muslim world as well. The question of blasphemy is also a question of law, and it is a question of colonial history. So I'm moving on to Pakistan. Recent events have led to the rise in debates, but also an increasing push in Pakistan to criminalize blasphemy. But of course, the criminalization of blasphemy and speech intended to either insult or outrage religious communities, the history of that is extremely long. It begins in 1860 in the Indian Penal Code. It's extended in 1927 within the British laws, and now is within the Pakistani Penal Code of Articles 295 to 298, part of a trajectory, first of defining what blasphemy is, and then second of aiming the prosecution of blasphemy at two targets, the first of which the policing of insults against the religion of Islam, and the second of which is the control of what are understood to be heretical groups within Muslim communities, the Ahmadiyya and the Qadariyya. And so, in most recent years, the question of blasphemy has also increased penalties within the criminal code, has extended to censoring of the internet. In 2010, for example, the temporary shutdown of or censorship of Facebook, of Google, of Yahoo, of YouTube, Amazon, Bing, and Hotmail. There is an expanding horizon here. And most of the prosecutions are aimed at Muslims and at Ahmadiyya, members of the Ahmadiyya. This is about the internal policing of belief and expression rather than the targeting of outsiders, or this is about the defining of outsiders rather than a sense of attack from the outside. Now Egypt is thinking about the possibility of criminalizing blasphemy within its constitution. And the first point to be made is that denigrating religion is already a crime in Egypt under the penal code, and the current effort is to put it in the constitution. Now the question is why? Why recriminalize a crime? And one of the answers has to do with electoral politics in Egypt and the rise of a sense that Islam needs to be protected in law far more than it has been. And this is also part of the new position of law in Egypt as a guarantor against authoritarianism, against various kinds of takeover of the government. But the position of law in Egypt has also been associated with a rise in control of the executive over legislation, increasing faith in the possibility of legislation to deliver Islamic goods, including the Sharia, and over again a view that I think is sort of increasingly a matter of public speech in the Middle East, that law rather than government is increasingly a way to protect Islam, to deliver Islam, and to make an Islamic state. And so the protesters outside the US Embassy after the video calling for the US government to punish the makers of the video when there is no such law in the US that would allow for such a thing, but there is a rhetorical place for law that, now that is new. Our historical trajectories about free speech are so different, and free speech itself is valorized to such an extent in the US that it's almost impossible to think about limits to public speech of any kind that are not abuses. But the language of free speech in Egypt has been different, as far as I have seen. And this is, I quote various reports being produced about what people are saying when they're talking about freedom of speech, protections within freedom of speech, and the limitations on freedom of speech. The general idea when it comes to speech or controlling speech in Egypt is that it's not about the individuals, it's about keeping order with the majority. And this is why, for example, we see much more uproar about protecting ideas or historical persons, but not about protecting society in hate speech or against specific groups of people, minorities in particular. And so the language of free speech in Egypt, in particular, seems to be a language of responsible free speech. And this is a difficult thing for us to even, I think, conceptualize. But I'd like to point out that even free speech in the West, in liberal democracies, is regulated speech. In the US, in Germany, and in France, there are laws that dictate what can and cannot be said. And these are about decisive moments in the history of a state and about the problem of political order and democracies. Free speech is not ever completely free. It is surrounded by a web of regulation, and it will continue to be important to think about what that regulation achieves and for whom. In the US, for example, speech is a highly regulated and regulatory thing. There are exceptions, they are situated, there are diminishments, and they are located within US government personnel, by strictures of private property and government speech, in the place of the mail, the airwaves, the military, in the area of immigration law, in prisons, in private businesses. And so even the idea of the regulation of speech, I think, needs to be thought of in more nuanced ways if we're to understand what the range of possibilities might be in places like Pakistan and Egypt. What does one do? Well, what does a state do? Here I turn to the question about foreign policy. And here we're standing at a highly charged time, domestically as well as internationally. And of course, electoral politics have everything to do with the way that rhetoric on the question of free speech, on blasphemy, on Islam is being read in the US today. But internationally, the question is also being fought on multiple fronts. And here, the question of what one does at the level of foreign policy puts any either electorally active president or aspiring president in a tricky position. On the one hand, it is impossible to dismiss the question of the anti-Islam video and protests on the Muslim street. And on the other hand, there's a very limited scope for what foreign policy could even logically or legitimately do. And so I'd like to offer a number of possibilities for reading the range of options. And the first is an awareness of how US actions are read in the Middle East, always through a trajectory and a lens of a long history of colonialism and neocolonialism in the region. So the question of speech, even though it may not seem like a colonial issue, is a colonial issue. And because, at the very least, because it will be read as such. A second is a careful examination of the implications of law as a panacea. Rule of law in this particular case is possibly far more about the possibility of the control and the limitation of free speech than its protection. And so in Pakistan and in Egypt, the idea of fully enforcing, fully facilitating the rule of law may have the unintended consequence of restricting freedom of speech. And this needs to be balanced against interests in the region as well. And the third and final point has to be how to recognize a response when we see it again. Of course, what we see, by definition of the media by which we see it, and by what is framed as worth seeing, is violent mass political mobilization. And so the only response that is visible is that of protest. What do we not see? One of the things we don't see is the large majority of Muslims who disagree but do not protest. The large majority of Muslims who distinguish between provocation and the need to respond to that provocation. Another thing we don't see is the long-term trajectory of Western representations of Islam, Muslims, and the Prophet, and the way in which all Muslim political action is constructed within Western discourse as religious rather than political, rather than economic or social or calculated or strategic along any of the other axes that we may think of. Another thing that is more difficult to see are the realities of economic, social, and demographic issues that will make the Muslim world a different place than we have, routinely conceived of it. Increasing unemployment, increasing wealth inequality, an increasing divide between the rural and the urban, and the fact that, unequivocal fact, that the majority of the Muslim world during the rest of our lifetimes will be under the age of 30. And again, how we engage this population needs to pay attention to all of these factors. And here we come back to the question of technology. I've been doing some new research on Muslim political and legal activity on the internet. And the research is in its preliminary stages, but a number of things are reasonably clear. One of which is that when Muslims go online, in the Muslim world as well as within the West, most of the things that matter to them have to do with ritual, have to do with matters of social and economic adjustment to the circumstances within which they find themselves, and has comparatively less to do with questions of protest, of political mobilization, or as politics as we tend to think about it when we read about Muslim political activity. A lot of the people who participate in online internet discussion groups, in fatwa-seeking sites, in chat rooms are disproportionately women, they are disproportionately young, and access and authority on these sites is increasingly fluid and diverse. Given this, the question of control becomes increasingly important. And again, here, it is not an easy dichotomy between secularism is progressive and Islamist is retrograde or conservative. Over and over again, we're seeing efforts on the behalf of sitting Muslim governments to control speech on the internet, to control questions of what is Islamic and what is not, what is legitimate and what is not, what is authoritative and what is not. And so these are projects that are being facilitated both by the surveillance that technology makes possible and being elicited by the opportunities for expression that technology makes possible.